When it comes to climate-fueled disasters, 2021 was a year of extremes. A polar vortex at the start of the year crippled the power grid in the US state of Texas. Deadly firestorms swept through the Mediterranean in August, and by the end of the year, large parts of Brazil were swallowed up by floodwaters. Climate scientists say there's little hope things will improve in 2022 and have renewed their calls for urgent action to limit global heating. Picking up on this, the editors of the Oxford English Dictionary recently added new entries to its inventory, including the phrase eco-anxiety, and have defined it as apprehension about current and future harm to the environment. Google Trends says searches for the phrase climate anxiety have gone up 565% in the past year. Unfortunately, anxiety is something the people of Afghanistan know all too well. Not only has the country been the staging ground for a protracted war between the United States, its allies, and the Taliban, but now it's facing another crisis, one which a well-intentioned international community may not be able to stop. Sarah Bolter has more.
It's hard to imagine this valley in northwest Afghanistan as fertile farmland fed by snowmelt and rainfall. But Abdul Hakim has watched it shrivel up and die in just a few decades, and with it, his livelihood.
There is no rain. There is drought. I'd say 5/6 of this village have left for Iran.
According to the UN, more than 80% of Afghanistan has been hit hard by the second drought in 4 years and the worst of its kind in decades. It's crippling food production, and more than half the population faces acute food shortages. In many places, drinking water is scarce.
I remember from childhood, from the age of 2 until recent years, there was a lot of snow in the winters. In spring we had a lot of rain, but for a few years there has been drought. There is no snow. There is much less rain. It is not even possible to get one bowl of water from drain pipes and use it.
The drought hits even harder during the pandemic in a nation destabilized by 40 years of war. Taliban officials say the previous government left them with nothing to respond to the crisis. Unable to cope, many families now live in displacement camps dependent on humanitarian aid. Like Yuldasta, a mother struggling to feed her children. The situation has become so dire, she's now forced to choose between them.
I told my husband, take him to the market and sell him, because we don't have any money for the bread for other kids. I'm helpless and have no other choice but to sell him and give him to someone else.
But as drought continues to parch the land and degrade the pastures of Afghanistan, selling one child will only feed the rest for so long. Sarah Bolter, TRT World.
Droughts like the one we just saw in Afghanistan are likely to make the country's precarious security situation even worse. It's one reason why members of the United Nations Security Council tried to pass a resolution that would have treated climate change and global heating as a threat to international peace and stability. It was the first time a resolution like this has been tabled at the UN, and it's not too surprising as nations begin to factor climate risks into their security strategies. TRT's Francis Collings takes a look at how an unstable climate can lead to an unstable world.
This was once a bustling trading hub, but the town of Dori in Burkina Faso is now struggling with insurgent attacks and food shortages, much of which can be linked to climate change. People here depend on crops for survival, but erratic rainfall means the crop yield is compromised. The town's once busy livestock market is shut down due to violence from groups linked to Al-Qaeda and Daesh, who can easily recruit hungry and disaffected people. In Burkina Faso and other countries on the edge of the Sahara, 5.5 million people now don't have enough to eat. Climate change may be seen as a threat to mankind, but it's not always viewed as a direct cause of conflict. Speaking at a UN Security Council meeting last year, The Kenyan president referred to droughts in the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and of Lake Chad reducing, talking of worsened economic vulnerabilities, setting in motion political, demographic and migratory dynamics that increase the threat of insurgency and violent extremism. Many analysts regard climate change as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing problems and instability. Just a few weeks ago, there was a UN Security Council resolution on climate change and security, put forward by Ireland and Niger, and co-sponsored by 113 countries.
Every conflict prevention initiative must take into account climate risks. Understanding and anticipating the cascading effects of climate change will strengthen our work on peace and security.
The aim was to place the security implications of climate change firmly on the agenda. It was vetoed by Russia, China abstained, and India voted no.
Today was an opportunity for the Council to recognise for the first time the reality of the world that we are living in, and that climate change is compounding insecurity and increasing instability.
The idea that a warming planet threatens stability is not a new one. The US Naval War College began studying this 30 years ago, and a report by US intelligence on worldwide threats in 2019 spoke of growing water and food insecurity that was increasing social unrest and interstate tension, as well as competition, particularly from Russia and China, for natural resources and new sea routes through the melting Arctic. Despite setbacks on collective action, there is growing awareness. The European Union, the United States, and other countries are building climate and security concerns into their planning for the future. And much of this comes down to money, holding richer nations to promises made at COP26 in Glasgow to developing nations to provide at least $100 billion a year to help fight the effects of the climate crisis. Until that is forthcoming, security issues linked to a warming world are likely to grow. Francis Collins, TRT World.
Jessica Hartog is a climate and peace expert at the independent organisation International Alert, and she joins us now. Jessica, thank you so much for your time. We often hear climate change and climate crisis, global heating, referred to as a threat multiplier. Can you explain for us, what does that actually mean? What does it look like for people on the ground?
Yeah, so talking about security, the threat that climate change impacts pose is subtle, but very concerning. Climate change is putting our economic, social and political systems under increasing pressure. And it can affect people's access to drinking water, access to fertile agricultural land, healthy forests. And it can therefore threaten people's capacity to sustain their livelihoods. And it might even encourage them, or in some cases even force them to migrate in search for alternative income sources. And as a result, we can see intensifying issues over inequality of access to resources or access to government services. And we see that especially in already fragile and conflict-affected contexts where governance tends to be weak, this can contribute to tensions and play into already simmering conflicts. And in fact, we see this most profoundly when the impacts of climate change overburden weak states.
And so you say it plays into an existing sort of underlying threat with weak governance. So is it then a case that it's just exacerbating existing security threats, or could it create new security problems?
It's more a case of exacerbating existing threats. So I can give an example of where this is really playing out. We see that, for instance, in Iraq, but also in Iran, where people are taking to the streets to voice their anger over water and electricity shortages. Now, that's related to poor governance of these resources, but it's all exacerbated by climate change impacts. And we see that these governments don't really have an answer to these problems either, and they fall back into their default repressive responses, like using excessive force. And it also really illustrates how state fragility can hamper government's ability to manage the climate change impacts. coupled with issues like rising demand for water and electricity, which is the case in Iran and Iraq.
So when the stakes are so high then, why do we see countries like Russia in the Security Council, China and India refusing to support a resolution that would really treat global heating as a security threat?
Those countries are really keen to kind of keep things separate and really focus on kind of the climate change as it is, and keep security as a separate issue. And it's a real concern, because we really need to see as a global community that we look at these issues in a very kind of coordinated, holistic way. Otherwise, we will just come up with very piecemeal, kind of siloed approaches to address these separate problems, which are actually integrated problems that need an integrated approach.
And just finally, and briefly if you could, do you then think this needs to come from somewhere like the United Nations, or is this the responsibility of individual governments?
To be honest, it's both. It's happening in individual governments, in individual countries, but it's also affecting kind of transboundary regions. And so hence that effort needs to come from individual countries, collaborating with their neighbors. But in reality, we need to see as well the global community, such as the United Nations, supporting countries to build their understanding of how climate and security are playing out, and finding ways in terms of what can be done to address it, because we really need to understand that they were really at the beginning phases of kind of understanding what's happening and what can be done. So it's basically a learning by doing that really needs concerted efforts by individual states supported by the global community.
Jessica Hartog, we appreciate your time and your expertise joining us from International Alert. Thanks for your time.
I am facing drought and famine. My fellow ranchers and I have lost a lot of camels and cattle.
Coming up on Just 2 Degrees, we'll go to Somalia, where the camel is king, but its reign is under threat. But first, Alaska is breaking temperature records, although not the ones you might be thinking of. Terms like global heating and climate crisis are thrown around a lot these days, so much so that we can sometimes feel desensitized to what it actually means to people's lives. So take a look at this. The coldest US state has recorded its hottest December day ever. The Alaskan island of Kodiak hit 19.4 degrees on December 26th. Now, that might not sound especially hot, but it is when you consider that the December average on Kodiak is 3 degrees. So this record is more than 16 degrees above the monthly average. Alaska is warming faster than any US state and twice as quickly as the global average. Now, this is particularly damaging in a state where many people rely on slow, seasonal glacial melt for drinking water. But in contrast, hotter temperatures are causing rapid melts. They're faster, more unpredictable, and contribute to rising sea levels. And that is threatening the very existence of numerous coastal communities. Staying in the Arctic region, and with more reindeer than people, it's not hard to see why Finland's Lapland is considered home to Santa's trusty helpers. Although it's thought to be one of the countries in the world least vulnerable to climate change, that's not how the reindeer herders there see it. Zeynep Gökçek has the story.
Anne Ollila is off to feed her reindeer. She's a herder, just like many others in Lapland's capital, Rovaniemi. Along with her husband and children, she carries on the family business that goes back 9 generations. But as winters have become warmer over the years, the reindeer aren't able to find food on their own. And feeding them with ivy branches and dried hay has become a financial burden for the herders. Not to mention, they also deal with tracking down animals that take off in search of lichen, their favourite food. Ollila blames this on the rain. that comes with warmer, unstable winters.
It makes ice covers, which reindeer cannot dig through, and they can't get food in the winter as well as they used to. And also summers are getting warmer, and reindeer is not very good handling heat. It cannot sweat, so it very easily overheat, and it might kill, hot summers might kill a lot of reindeer.
And while the reindeer aren't dying, according to a 20-year study by Norway's James Hutton Institute, they're getting smaller and lighter. This is an important issue for herders who raise reindeer for meat. And it's a problem that can be seen all across the Arctic, which scientists say is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. They've long argued stopping global heating at 1.5 degrees Celsius can limit some of the catastrophic future damage caused by climate change. But Arctic researcher Nuccio Mazzulo says that number is impossible for reindeer herders.
The north is actually, the temperature is going faster. It's not like the 1.5 is, it would be a threshold that shouldn't be crossed, but I mean here we're going to go beyond that. I mean there are some projections that they even talk about 3 degrees.
But herders are already under pressure from mining, forestry and land use. And the addition of climate change, they fear, could bring an end to their traditional lifestyles.
They eat it.
As for Ollila, she's worried, but optimistic. She believes herders will somehow find solutions because they don't have a choice. Zeynep Gökçe, TRT World.
What could the melting of the Antarctic ice sheets have to do with the drying of the Amazon rainforest? Well, according to one study, if global temperatures increase just 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, it could spark a dangerous domino effect. And scientists warn, unless greenhouse gas emissions are drastically reduced, crossing that tipping point is inevitable. The paper is the work of researchers at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. They found that even moderate global heating could cause ice sheets and ocean currents to destabilise each other. The team ran 3 million computer simulations and found that nearly 1/3 resulted in catastrophic domino effects. They say this could lead to accelerated sea level rises and species loss, which could impact 40% of the world's population. Nico Wunderling is one of the authors of this report from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and he joins us now. Nico, thank you for your time. We often talk about the effects of climate change simply in isolation. We talk about droughts or we talk about a flood. But your research looks at how these all interact with each other. Tell us more.
Yeah, actually, that's true. We're very much looking into individual tipping elements so far. And the thing that we tried at the Potsdam Institute now is to couple some of these regional to continental scale tipping elements together to find what the impacts of interactions between these elements are. So, for instance, the interactions between the Arctic or Western Arctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, the ocean currents, such as the Gulf Stream, and, as you said, the Amazon rainforest.
And so what did you find? What does it look like? Dare I say worst case scenario when these things interact?
Well, overall, we found that the interactions tend to make the effects of the individual tipping elements a bit worse, so to say. So, for instance, if you imagine that the Greenland ice sheet starts to melt or starts to tip, that's what we say for kind of disintegrate or melt the Greenland ice sheet, then fresh water is put into the ocean current, into the Atlantic, and that can slow down the Atlantic and then potentially trigger another tipping point, which can then be transferred to further tipping elements, such as the Amazon rainforest. So indeed, what we found is that these interactions make it worse, and the stronger these interactions are, the worse it gets.
It seems to make so much sense looking at how all these things interact because, you know, everything that happens in our world, it all impacts each other. Why has it been so difficult to really be able to simulate these interactions?
Well, the difficulties are mostly in the uncertainties of the interaction processes, but also in some simulations with the individual tipping elements themselves. And it's so difficult to actually quantify what the exact effect of the interactions are. And our study is, I would say, for sure not the last answer. It's basically a starting point of how interactions could be taken into a rather simple model and what the effects of these interactions are. So I'm sure that there are further and more elaborate studies to come. However, this is one of the first studies that has in particular looked at these interactions.
And just finally, your research found that in particular, it's the polar ice sheets that are really important to overall stability. Why?
Yeah, we indeed found that the Western Arctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet are the main trigger points or the main initiators of the emergence of such tipping cascades. And the reason for that is that the critical threshold, so to say, so the global warming that you need to start melting the Western Arctic ice sheet or the Greenland ice sheet is lower than for the other tipping elements. And so it makes sense that these are the first ones to disintegrate, and then their effect via the interactions is brought forward to the ocean currents, to, for instance, the Gulf Stream, and then makes their impact at these tipping elements.
And I'm just going to ask you one final but very brief question. How do we stop it?
Yeah, well, the easy answer is stop emitting fossil fuel or greenhouse gases to stop global warming. And it would be best to limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees, since this is really, at 1.5, it's really the starting point of the risk zone, so where these tipping risks really become larger, even though they take a long time to melt down. So, for instance, for the ice sheets.
It's such interesting research, but such worrying research at the same time. Nico Wunderling, we really appreciate your time here on Just 2 Degrees.
Thank you very much for having me.
In Somalia, like many parts of the world, the camel is king. It's home to the largest camel population in the world. They're a symbol of an age-old way of life, whose gangly bodies both transport and nourish Somalis. But punishing droughts and unreliable rain are testing the creature's famed resilience and destroying the herding tradition. Dominic Brian Omondi brings us the story.
Nomad Ali Abdi Elmi says his camels are a gift from the gods. They feed him and he searches out grass for them in the middle of the desert.
I drink camel milk because it's nourishing. The milk is good for us because camels graze from trees with medicinal properties that help fight diseases. I have 5 children and we all depend on camel milk to survive.
The camel is king in this culture.
Camels are very important in Somalia because one is always considered rich or can rise in social status by the number of camels he has.
Camels are valuable investment in Somalia. A camel of this caliber can sell up to $1,000. But as the drought takes hold, life gets more difficult for herders. It's forcing them to travel further to find food and water for their animals.
I am facing drought and famine. My fellow ranchers and I have lost a lot of camels and cattle.
Somalia has weathered a 2020 cyclone and several recent droughts. Natural disasters have killed thousands of herds of livestock. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, animals account 80% of the country's exports. Hunger and desperation have driven millions of Somalis to the cities. Herders don't want to give up life on the land, but they say they may have no choice if the climate continues to decimate their livestock and livelihoods.
That's all we have time for on this episode of Just 2 Degrees. I'm Melinda Nusofora. Thanks for your company.